The avoidant expected drama, emotional breakdowns, desperate attempts at reconciliation. They prepared themselves for your anger, your pain, your begging them to reconsider. They were ready to handle your reaction with their usual mix of guilt and defensive justification. But you did something they never anticipated. You accepted the situation with grace and moved on. You didn't fall apart. You didn't chase them. You didn't make their decision harder by showing how devastated you were. Instead, you responded with calm acceptance that communicated you'd be fine without them. This response has completely destabilized the avoidant in ways emotional reactivity never could. They can't process your composure because it doesn't fit any script they anticipated. Your coolness about what happened is triggering deeper anxiety than your distress ever would have because it suggests they didn't matter as much as they thought, that the relationship was more replaceable than they believed, that their impact on you was less significant than their ego required. The avoidant is spiraling specifically because you're not spiraling, and this reversal has shattered every assumption they held about the dynamic between you. The narrative collapse of indispensability. The avoidant maintained an unconscious belief that they were essential to your well-being and happiness. This belief allowed them to withdraw and maintain distance without feeling guilty because they told themselves you'd wait, you'd understand, you'd be there when they were ready. Your apparent devastation during the relationship reinforced this narrative. Every time you expressed hurt about their unavailability, you confirmed how much you needed them. Every time you pursued connection, you demonstrated their importance to you. The avoidant could be dismissive because they believed their centrality in your life was secure, but your calm acceptance of the end destroys this entire narrative structure. If you're fine without them, they were never as essential as they believed. The foundation of their self-importance in relation to you has crumbled. This collapse triggers profound disorientation for the avoidant. Their identity in the relationship was partially built on being the more valuable partner, the one who was harder to keep, the one you needed more than they needed you. Your composure suggests this power dynamic was illusory. You're demonstrating that you can exist perfectly well without them, which means their withdrawal didn't have the impact they unconsciously expected. The avoidant thought leaving would devastate you, and your lack of devastation devastates them. They wanted to matter enough that their absence created crisis, and your calm suggests their absence is manageable. This realization attacks the avoidant's sense of self-worth in ways they can't easily defend against. The narrative collapse also forces the avoidant to reconsider the entire history of the relationship. If you're this okay with the ending, were you ever as invested as they thought? Did you care as much as you claimed? Was the connection as deep as they believed? The avoidant starts rewriting history in their mind, questioning moments that previously seemed clear. Your coolness makes them doubt everything because it contradicts the story they told themselves about your desperate need for them. The avoidant is experiencing retroactive uncertainty about the relationship's significance, and this uncertainty is more painful than the straightforward grief they anticipated causing. The collapse of their indispensability narrative also removes the avoidant's justification for their own behavior. They could be distant and withholding because you were so invested and available. The asymmetry meant they had power and control. But if you weren't as dependent as they thought, their entire strategy seems unnecessary and foolish. They maintain distance to protect themselves from someone who apparently didn't need them enough to be destroyed by their absence. The avoidant is confronting that they protected themselves from a threat that wasn't as significant as they imagined. And this recognition makes their defensive behavior seem pointless rather than prudent. The fantasy of your suffering. The avoidant unconsciously needed you to suffer to validate the relationship's importance and their own significance. They didn't want you to suffer in the sense of wishing you harm, but they needed evidence that losing them mattered, that the relationship had been meaningful, that their presence in your life had impact. Your suffering would have confirmed all of this while also alleviating their guilt about ending things. If you were destroyed, they'd feel terrible but also important. Your pain would validate that they made a real choice with real consequences, that the relationship was genuine and deep. But your composure denies them this validation, leaving them with nothing to confirm the relationship's significance. The fantasy of your suffering was also the avoidant's way of maintaining connection after separation. They imagined you thinking about them constantly, missing them desperately, hoping they'd come back. This fantasy allowed them to feel like the relationship continued in your inner world, even if it had ended in external reality. Your coolness destroys this fantasy completely. If you're not suffering, you're probably not thinking about them much. If you're fine, you've probably moved on emotionally. The avoidant loses not just the relationship, but the imagined ongoing impact on you that made the loss feel less complete. They're confronting true separation rather than the partial separation they'd envisioned where you remained attached while they maintained distance. The need for your suffering also reveals the avoidant's own investment in the relationship. They wanted you to be devastated because they're devastated, but they can't show their devastation without vulnerability. Your pain would have been a mirror of their pain, validating that what they're feeling is real and warranted. But your calm acceptance leaves them alone with feelings they can't justify. If you're fine, why aren't they fine? If the relationship ending doesn't destroy you, why does it feel so heavy to them? The avoidant is forced to confront that they might have been more invested than you were, and this reversal of the anticipated dynamic is unbearable. The fantasy of your suffering ultimately reveals the avoidant's hidden hope for reconnection. If you were destroyed, there was a path back. They could return when they felt ready, and you'd still be there, hurt but willing to try again. Your suffering would have kept the door open, but your coolness suggests the door is closed, that you've accepted the end as final, that you're not waiting for them to come back. The avoidant is losing not just the current relationship, but all future possibility of that relationship, and the finality is more terrifying than they anticipated. Your composure communicates that you've moved forward in ways that don't include them, and this forward movement eliminates the option they wanted to keep open. The rejection reversal recognition. The avoidant positioned themselves as the one doing the leaving, maintaining control over the relationship's end. They made the choice to create distance, to end things, to walk away. This positioning protected their ego and allowed them to avoid the vulnerability of being left. But your cool acceptance flips the script in subtle but devastating ways. By accepting their decision with grace and moving on quickly, you're essentially affirming that leaving was the right choice. You're agreeing with them in a way that feels like rejection. The avoidant thought they were rejecting you, but your response suggests you're actually fine with being rejected, which means you're rejecting them back. They don't have the power they thought they had because you're not fighting their decision. This reversal triggers the avoidant's deepest fears about rejection and abandonment. They structured the ending to avoid these feelings, but your coolness activates them anyway. If you're this okay with them leaving, maybe you wanted them to leave. Maybe you were tired of their unavailability and relieved to be done. Maybe you're actually happier without them. The avoidant starts interpreting your composure as evidence that you didn't really want them anyway, that they were more burden than blessing in your life. This interpretation allows them to feel rejected despite being the one who left, and it triggers all the defensive and hurt responses they were trying to avoid by controlling the ending. The rejection reversal also means the avoidant loses the moral high ground they unconsciously claimed. When they positioned themselves as the leaver, they could tell themselves they were being honest about their limitations, setting you free to find someone better, doing the hard but right thing. But if you're fine with being set free, their justifications sound hollow. They weren't nobly sacrificing the relationship for your benefit. They were protecting themselves, and you've moved on from that protection without issue. The avoidant is confronted with the selfishness of their choice rather than the selflessness they told themselves it represented. Your coolness strips away their rationalizations and leaves them facing the uncomfortable truth of their motivation. The recognition of rejection reversal means the avoidant can't maintain their preferred narrative about the relationship's ending. They wanted to be the important one who was too damaged to stay, the person you'd miss terribly but understand had to leave. Instead, they're becoming the person who left and wasn't missed as much as they expected. The story they're telling themselves no longer matches the reality of your response, and this mismatch creates cognitive dissonance they can't resolve. The avoidant is trapped between their need to see themselves as the one with power and the evidence that you've taken that power by not caring that they're gone. The investment reassessment spiral. Your composure forces the avoidant to question their assumptions about who was more invested in the relationship. They believed they were the less invested party, the one who could leave more easily, the one who needed the relationship less. This belief justified their behavior and protected their ego. But your calm acceptance suggests you might have been less invested than they thought, or at least less destroyed by the loss than they anticipated. The avoidant begins spiraling through questions about investment levels. Were you faking your feelings during the relationship? Were you using them for something? Were you actually ready for it to end? Did you care at all? The reassessment spiral includes the avoidant reviewing the entire relationship through a new lens. They remember moments where you expressed need and now wonder if you were performing. They recall times you seemed hurt by their distance and question whether that hurt was genuine or manipulative. They're reframing history to match their current confusion, trying to reconcile the person who seemed so invested during the relationship with the person who seems so unbothered by its ending. This reframing is the avoidant's attempt to make sense of data that doesn't fit their model of the dynamic, and it's creating more confusion than clarity. The spiral also forces the avoidant to consider that they might have been the more invested partner all along. This possibility is almost unbearable because it contradicts their entire self-concept and the role they played in the relationship. They were supposed to be the detached one, the person who could take or leave connection, the one who was always slightly less engaged. But if you're this fine without them, maybe they were the one who needed the relationship more. Maybe their distance was overcompensation for caring too much, rather than evidence of caring too little. The avoidant is confronting the possibility that they were more vulnerable than they realized, and this vulnerability terrifies them. The investment reassessment ultimately leaves the avoidant in a state of painful uncertainty. They can't trust their perceptions of the relationship anymore. They can't be sure what was real and what was performance. They can't know if they mattered or if they were just filling a temporary space in your life. This uncertainty is worse than the clear pain they expected to cause because it calls into question everything they thought they knew. The avoidant is lost in confusion of their own making, unable to find solid ground in their understanding of what the relationship meant and how much it mattered to either of you. The control through suffering loss. The avoidant maintained a sense of control through their ability to impact your emotional state. Your reactions to their behavior gave them feedback about their importance and power in the dynamic. When they withdrew, you pursued. When they were cold, you tried harder. Your responses were predictable and manageable, allowing the avoidant to feel in control of the relationship's emotional landscape. But your cool acceptance removes this control completely. You're not reacting in ways they can predict or manage. You're not giving them the feedback loop they relied on to understand the dynamic. The avoidant is suddenly powerless because they can't influence your emotional state through their usual tactics. This loss of control manifests as the avoidant testing your boundaries and composure. They might reach out with seemingly casual messages, checking if you'll respond with warmth or coolness. They might post on social media designed to provoke a reaction, trying to see if you're still paying attention. They might ask mutual friends about you, seeking information about whether you're really as fine as you seem. All of these behaviors are attempts to regain some sense of control over your emotional response to them. The avoidant needs to know they can still affect you because affecting you was how they maintained power in the relationship. The loss of control also means the avoidant can't comfort themselves with the thought that they could come back if they wanted to. When you were visibly suffering, they maintained the option of return. They could always change their mind, reach out, and you'd probably respond positively because you were still emotionally engaged. But your coolness suggests that return might not be welcome anymore. You've moved on in ways that close the door to easy reconnection. The avoidant is losing not just current control, but future control, the option to revisit the relationship when they felt ready. Your composure is eliminating options they wanted to keep open indefinitely. The control loss ultimately triggers the avoidant's core terror of powerlessness in relationship. They structured their entire attachment style around maintaining control through distance and withdrawal. But your response to their withdrawal isn't something they can control. You're making autonomous choices about how to handle the situation, and those choices don't include falling apart or waiting for them. The avoidant is confronting the limits of their control strategies, recognizing that they only work when the other person cooperates by being predictably distressed. You've stopped cooperating, and their entire system for managing relationship anxiety has become ineffective. The ego wound of replaceability. Your coolness suggests you've either moved on emotionally or are in the process of moving on, which means you're replacing them in your life. This possibility creates an ego wound the avoidant wasn't prepared for. They unconsciously believed they were irreplaceable, that what they offered you was unique and couldn't be found elsewhere. Your calm acceptance of their absence suggests this belief was wrong. You're finding happiness and stability without them, which means they weren't as special as they thought. The avoidant is confronting their own replaceability, and this confrontation attacks their sense of uniqueness and value. The ego wound manifests as the avoidant obsessing over who or what is replacing them in your life. They imagine you with someone new who can offer the presence and commitment they couldn't provide. They wonder if you're spending time with friends who are supporting you through the transition. They question whether you've found activities or interests that fill the space they used to occupy. Every possibility of replacement triggers jealousy and inadequacy. The avoidant thought they were the special element in your life that couldn't be substituted, and your composure proves that everything can be substituted if you're motivated enough to find alternatives. The wound also includes the avoidant's recognition that their unique value proposition wasn't actually valuable enough to be worth the difficulties they created. They might have offered certain qualities or experiences that were special, but those special elements weren't sufficient to outweigh the pain of their unavailability. You're demonstrating that you'd rather have ordinary connection than special disconnection, that consistency matters more than unique chemistry, that showing up is more valuable than being interesting. The avoidant is learning that their particular brand of specialness wasn't as important as they believed, and this lesson is humbling and painful. The replaceability wound ultimately forces the avoidant to question what they actually bring to relationship. If you can be this fine without them, what were they really offering? If their absence doesn't create a void you can't fill, were they actually adding value or just taking up space? These questions attack the avoidant's sense of worthiness in relationship. They want to matter uniquely and significantly, but your cool response suggests they were just another person in your life who you can live without. The avoidant is experiencing the ego death of discovering they're not as essential or irreplaceable as their self-concept required them to be. The delayed consequence realization. The avoidant didn't fully think through the consequences of ending the relationship because they unconsciously assumed those consequences would be manageable and reversible. They thought they'd feel relief at being free from relationship pressure. They anticipated you'd be hurt, but eventually heal, and maybe they could reconnect when they felt more ready. They imagined maintaining some kind of ongoing connection, or at least ongoing significance in your life. But your composure is revealing consequences they didn't anticipate. You're actually moving on completely. The door is actually closing. The relationship is actually ending in final rather than temporary ways. The avoidant is realizing the consequences are bigger and more permanent than they imagined. This delayed realization creates panic that the avoidant wasn't prepared to feel. They made their choice based on immediate discomfort with intimacy and vulnerability, not considering the long-term implications of losing you permanently. Now those implications are becoming clear, and they're more severe than anticipated. The avoidant is losing not just the current relationship, but all the potential futures that relationship contained. They're losing access to your support, your presence, your understanding of them. They're losing the comfort of knowing someone knows them deeply, even if they kept that person at distance. All of these losses are registering in delayed fashion, and the accumulation is overwhelming. The consequence realization also includes the avoidant recognizing they can't undo their choice. Your coolness suggests you've accepted the ending as final and won't be receptive to attempts at reconnection. Even if the avoidant realizes they made a mistake, they can't fix that mistake because you've moved on. They're trapped with a decision they can't reverse and consequences they can't escape. This irreversibility is terrifying for someone whose entire strategy has been keeping options open and maintaining control. The avoidant is confronting that some doors, once closed, don't reopen, and your composure is closing the door firmly. The delayed realization means the avoidant is experiencing grief and regret after the point where those feelings could serve any purpose. If they'd felt this pain before ending things, they might have made different choices. But feeling it now, after you've accepted the ending and started moving on, is futile. The avoidant is suffering consequences that can't motivate change because the opportunity for change has passed. They're learning from their mistake too late to do anything about it, and this timing makes the lesson more bitter than instructive. Your coolness is proof that the moment for repair has expired. The attachment activation through loss. The avoidance attachment system is activating in response to your unexpected composure in ways it didn't activate when they made the choice to leave. Initially, their deactivating strategies were in full force, suppressing any attachment feelings and allowing them to end things without experiencing significant distress. But watching you accept the ending calmly is triggering attachment panic that bypasses their defenses. The avoidant is suddenly feeling all the need, longing, and fear of loss that their system is designed to suppress. Your coolness is paradoxically creating more attachment activation than your previous pursuit ever did. This activation occurs specifically because your composure signals true loss in ways your previous distress didn't. When you were clearly upset about their behavior during the relationship, it meant you were still engaged and fighting for connection. The avoidant could deactivate because there was no real threat of loss, but your calm acceptance signals genuine departure, true ending, real abandonment. This actual threat to attachment security triggers the attachment system in ways that hypothetical or partial threats never did. The avoidance nervous system is responding to the reality of losing you by flooding them with all the attachment feelings they've spent their life avoiding. The activation through loss also means the avoidant is experiencing feelings they successfully avoided while the relationship was available. They're feeling desperate need for you now that you're demonstrating you don't need them. They're feeling terror of abandonment now that you're actually leaving psychologically, even though they left first behaviorally. They're feeling all the vulnerable, dependent, need-based emotions that healthy attachment involves, but they're feeling these emotions too late for them to serve any productive purpose. The cruel irony is that your coolness is giving the avoidant access to attachment feelings that could have sustained the relationship, but those feelings are emerging only after the relationship has ended. The attachment activation ultimately proves that the avoidance distance and independence were defensive rather than authentic. Their nervous system is revealing the truth their conscious strategies denied. They're attached to you, they depend on you psychologically, they're affected by losing you. Your composure is stripping away their defenses and exposing their genuine attachment needs. The avoidant is experiencing the terror and vulnerability they've organized their entire life to avoid, and they're experiencing these feelings alone because they created the distance that made this loss possible. They're learning that deactivating strategies protect them from feeling attachment until the moment attachment is truly threatened, at which point the feelings emerge with full force. The comparative advantage loss. The avoidant believed their primary value in the relationship came from being less needy, more independent, and emotionally stronger than you. This comparative advantage made them feel superior and valuable. They were the stable one, the one who could handle things, the one who wasn't falling apart over relationship issues. But your cool response to the ending destroys this comparative advantage completely. You're demonstrating more emotional strength and stability than they anticipated. You're handling the loss better than they're handling it. You're being the less needy person, the more independent one, the emotionally stronger party. The roles have reversed, and the reversal is devastating to the avoidant's ego. This loss of comparative advantage forces the avoidant to reconsider their entire self-concept in relation to you. They thought they were helping you by being the stable presence in your life. They believed you needed them for emotional ballast and grounding. But your composure suggests you didn't need them for stability because you have your own. You're grounded without their grounding influence. You're stable without their stabilizing presence. The avoidant is recognizing that they were projecting their own needs onto you, imagining you required things from them that you actually didn't require. This recognition is humbling and disorienting. The comparative advantage loss also means the avoidant can't use your perceived weakness as justification for their distance anymore. They could be unavailable because you were too needy. They could maintain boundaries because you were too dependent. But if you're actually fine on your own, their distance wasn't protective or necessary. It was just their inability to show up, and they can't blame that inability on your excessive needs anymore. The avoidant is losing the rationalization that allowed them to feel okay about their behavior. They have to confront that they were the weak one, the incapable one, the person who couldn't handle the vulnerability of real connection. The loss of comparative advantage ultimately forces the avoidant to see themselves less favorably than they saw themselves during the relationship. They're not the strong, independent person who was graciously tolerating a needy partner. They're the person who was too scared to engage fully with someone who turned out to be strong enough to survive their absence. The avoidant is experiencing a collapse in self-esteem that comes from recognizing they weren't as superior as they believed. Your coolness is a mirror showing them their own weakness reflected back, and the image is difficult to accept. The fantasy of mutual devastation. The avoidant unconsciously fantasized that ending the relationship would be mutually devastating, that both of you would suffer equally even if you expressed it differently. This fantasy allowed them to feel connected to you through shared pain, united in the difficulty of separation even while separated. They imagined you crying while they stoically held their feelings inside, both of you suffering the same loss in different ways. But your cool composure destroys this fantasy completely. You're not suffering the way they're suffering. The devastation isn't mutual. You're handling the loss with grace while they're falling apart internally. The imagined unity in pain has revealed itself as the avoidant's private suffering that you don't share. This fantasy collapse isolates the avoidant in their grief. They can't comfort themselves with the thought that you feel as badly as they do. They can't imagine you lying awake thinking about them the way they're lying awake thinking about you. They can't believe you're struggling with the same regret and longing they're experiencing. Your coolness suggests you've processed the loss and moved on while they're stuck at the beginning of grief. The avoidant is alone in their suffering, and this isolation makes the suffering worse. They wanted the connection of mutual pain, and instead they have the disconnection of asymmetrical response to loss. The fantasy of mutual devastation also served the avoidant's need to believe the relationship was equally important to both parties. If you're both destroyed by its ending, it must have mattered equally. But if you're fine and they're not fine, maybe it didn't matter equally. Maybe they were more invested than they realized. Maybe they needed it more than they admitted. The asymmetry in response to loss reveals asymmetry in investment that the avoidant didn't want to acknowledge. Your composure is proof that the relationship might have been more important to them than to you, and this realization is unbearable for someone whose identity was built on being the less invested partner. The collapse of this fantasy means the avoidant loses the imagined connection they maintained through shared suffering. They wanted to be united with you in pain even while separated in reality, but your coolness breaks that union. You're not experiencing what they're experiencing. You're not suffering what they're suffering. The avoidant is truly alone in their response to the loss, and this aloneness is the exact outcome they were trying to avoid through their defensive strategies. They protected themselves from vulnerability in relationship only to experience complete vulnerability in separation, and the irony is not lost on them. The narrative control collapse. The avoidant carefully controlled the narrative around the relationship's ending, framing themselves as the person who was being honest about their limitations and setting you free to find someone better. This narrative allowed them to feel noble and self-aware rather than scared and incapable. But your cool acceptance of their leaving suggests you agree with their narrative a little too enthusiastically. You're acting like being set free is actually a gift, like you're better off without them, like their limitations were indeed too significant to work around. The avoidant wanted you to reject their narrative and fight for the relationship, but instead, you've accepted it completely and moved on accordingly. This acceptance destroys their control over the story's meaning. The narrative collapse forces the avoidant to reconsider whether their framing of the ending was accurate or just protective rationalization. They told themselves they were leaving for your benefit, but your coolness suggests you benefit from their absence in ways they didn't intend. They framed themselves as too damaged to stay, and you've apparently agreed rather than insisting they were worth the difficulty. The avoidant wanted you to see through their justifications and recognize them as defenses, but instead, you took them at their word. Now they're trapped in the narrative they created, unable to revise it without admitting they were lying to themselves and you about their motivations. The control collapse also means the avoidant can't shape how the relationship is remembered or discussed. They wanted to control the story that gets told about why things ended, painting themselves in the best possible light while maintaining sympathy. But your composure suggests you have your own story about what happened, and that story might not center their damage or limitations. You might tell people you left someone who couldn't show up rather than someone who nobly left you. The avoidant is losing control over the narrative at the exact moment they most need that control to protect their ego and reputation. The loss of narrative control ultimately leaves the avoidant without the story they need to make sense of their choice. They told themselves a particular story about why leaving was necessary and right, but your cool response undermines that story's coherence. If you're fine, was leaving necessary? If you've moved on easily, was the relationship as significant as they believed? The avoidant is trapped in narrative uncertainty, unable to construct a story about what happened that makes them feel okay about their role in it. Your composure has taken away their ability to control meaning, leaving them with actions they can't justify and choices they can't defend. The permanence recognition terror. The avoidant is slowly realizing that your coolness indicates permanent ending rather than temporary distance. They unconsciously expected the relationship to remain accessible as an option, something they could return to if they changed or circumstances shifted. But your composed acceptance signals that you've closed that option, that you're treating the ending as final and irreversible. The avoidant is confronting true permanence of loss for possibly the first time in their life, and the confrontation is terrifying. They've always maintained escape routes and kept doors open, but your coolness is closing the door firmly and apparently permanently. This permanence recognition triggers existential terror about loss and irreversibility. The avoidant built their life around the belief that nothing has to be permanent, that they can always change their mind, that options remain open indefinitely. But you're demonstrating that some things do end permanently, that some choices can't be undone, that some doors close and don't reopen. The avoidant is facing the reality that they've permanently lost something valuable, and permanent loss is the exact experience their entire defensive structure is designed to prevent. They're experiencing the thing they've feared most, and it's happening specifically because of choices they made. The terror of permanence also includes the avoidant's recognition that time is moving forward in ways they can't control. While they've been maintaining distance and avoiding decisions, you've been healing and moving on and building a life that doesn't include them. The temporal dimension of your moving forward makes reconnection increasingly impossible, even if the avoidant wanted to attempt it. Your coolness proves that you're living in the present and future while they're stuck in the past, and this temporal divergence means you're becoming more unavailable to them with each passing day. The permanence isn't just about the relationship ending, but about you becoming a different person who's incompatible with reconnection. The permanence recognition ultimately forces the avoidant to grieve in ways they've never had to grieve before. They can't comfort themselves with fantasies of eventual reconnection. They can't tell themselves this is just temporary distance that will eventually close. They have to accept that this loss is real, final, and complete. Your composure is the evidence that forces this acceptance, and the acceptance is breaking something in the avoidant that they've never experienced breaking before. They're learning what permanent loss feels like, and they're learning it through losing you specifically, which makes the lesson personal and devastating rather than abstract and manageable.